We are in Champions League, man.
That was my next
Dilly din,
question.
dilly dong, come on.
Encara Messi, 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 gol, 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 gol.
Into Sheringham, and Solskjaer has won it!
I will love it if we beat them. Love it.
This is the Modern Soccer Coach Podcast with Gary Curneen.
Hello, welcome to the Modern Soccer Coach Podcast. My name is Gary Curneen. My guest for today is Doug Lemov, and our topic is improving teaching, communication and organisation in a training session. Doug is a teacher and teaching mentor. He's an author of a few phenomenal books: Teach Like a Champion, Reading Reconsidered, Practice Perfect. He studies high-performing teachers and teaches coaches and teachers how to use effective techniques and skills in the classroom and in different environments as well. He talks about preparation, utilising staff, making an impact without continually stopping the sessions, and evaluating player and coach performances after the session. I also asked Doug for some advice and guidance on areas that I really want to improve, specifically in my own coaching as well. This episode of the Modern Soccer Coach Podcast is once again sponsored by Total Football Analysis magazine. They are a digital magazine for all soccer fans, coaches, managers and analysts. If you're looking for more detail than a match report but don't want to get bogged down in numbers and stats that make no sense, this is the magazine for you. February's Total Football Analysis magazine has just gone on sale, and you can pick up 135 pages of pure football tactical analysis that includes Gianpiero Gasparini on his continuous improvement with Atalanta, Arthur Melo and Is He Really the New Xavi, Timothy Weah, the American thriving at Celtic, and coaching exercises, defend the counter-attack like Pep. You can buy each magazine individually or take out a monthly subscription which come with some added extras. And you can get 10% off all annual subscriptions by entering the code ModernSoccerCoach at checkout. Head over to totalfootballanalysis.com/magazine to get yours today. Highly recommend it, folks. I love the magazine. It takes me a couple of weeks to get through it right enough because it's so detailed and in depth, and really enjoy it. Loads of animations, loads of things for coaches as well that I really enjoy about it, that it ties into training sessions. So yeah, looking forward to this month, and I've got every magazine so far up until now, and yeah, highly recommend it. So here we go, training sessions, coaching, Doug Lemov. Enjoy. Doug, thanks so much for joining me today on the Modern Soccer Coach Podcast. Really excited to have you on.
Me as well. I'm glad to be with you. Thanks, Gary.
I wanted to be real specific in the title here, and how to make training sessions better, starting with the planning process. And, a lot of this is from my own perspective. So planning the sessions, exercises are where most of us put our focus. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until your conversation with Dan Abrams on his podcast that I realized how often I was with my staff. That wasn't ever part of my planning, was how to empower them in terms of them coaching rather than picking up cones. So how can we empower and utilize our staff more?
Yeah, I think it's a great question because there's so much talent on our staffs and often waiting to be utilized. And the more you utilize them, the more gratified they are, the happier they are, the more they, it's a virtuous cycle. I was thinking about this, and I think a couple of things that I would probably want to think about. Generally, I think one of the most powerful things that you can do as a coach from a planning perspective is to, before the training session starts, anticipate errors and plan out an exemplar, which is, I think we're really familiar with most of the activities that we run. We tend to run them a lot. But I still think it's worth thinking through not just what's the activity that I'm doing, but what does excellence look like? What is my goal for players to do during the activity, right? So we're building out of the back, and I have an exercise that I do for building out of the back that I do over and over again. But I think taking the time to write down and not just talk about what are the 4 or 5 most important things that we should be doing when we're building out of the back, so we're not just completing the exercise, but we're completing it with a standard of excellence, is important. And the second step would be, and then anticipating the errors. What are the things we're likely to get wrong if we do a B+ version of it? Where are the places we're likely to fall down? And I think that this is an ideal place to involve your assistant coaches for two reasons. I think they'll see things that you might not see and will have ideas for that are key. But then when the session starts, one of the main things I might want my assistants to do is to be gathering data. How are players doing? So if we decide there are 4 things that we have to do to make sure that we're building out of the back effectively, now my assistant coaches know what things to look for, and I can pause and say, great, what are you seeing? Because we've kind of decided in advance what we're looking for. So I can really solicit their input more intentionally because we've decided what we're all watching for in an aligned kind of way. And then to the degree that they're making live comments to players and saying to things to players individually while they're playing, they're more likely to be productive comments because they'll be aligned to the goal, right? We've decided that one of the keys when we're building out of the back is we have to make sure that, every ball is struck at pace on the ground. And since we've decided that's one of our priorities now, they're more likely to comment on that as opposed to, the assistant talking about something that's totally different from what I want to get out of the exercise.
In that planning process, should we be looking specifically more towards individuals, or do you think it's all collective that's acceptable? Is it attainable? And where's the balance there?
Yeah, it's great. I'd imagine it's some of both, that there are group things we all need to do that we want to look for as a team. But to go back to the example of building out of the back, there are different things I want to see from my center backs and from my number 6 and my wide backs. So, and maybe I also have an individual player who's likely to make a specific mistake, and I think that might be a great thing for an assistant to do, which is generally as the head coach, I'm looking for the 4 key things that that we're working on. What we've decided is excellent, but I can ask my assistant, I really want you to keep an eye on David building out of the back. He's likely to do this, and I really want you to give him constant reinforcement on this point. So I think that's maybe a way to. I think the short answer to your question is both, which is hard, but I think a great role for an assistant is to focus on one player and one task and really stay on him. I think that the learning comes in the repetition from doing it right. So having a player really get constant, you can't attend to what every player is doing at all times during every activity. But if there's someone who I know has something I want them to work on, I can really ask one of my assistants to lock in on that and pay attention to that specifically.
As sports science has grown and awareness has been increased, the challenge has now been presented for coaches with certain training loads and with certain goals, especially at the highest levels where the data is being collected. As a coach, you don't want to come into the session because it may directly impact the physical objectives if you come in a couple of times. So what are the best ways for a coach to impact a session without directly coming in 5 or 6 times?
Yeah, I think if you're in other words, you don't want to break the session and disrupt the intensity of it by talking and therefore having it be downtime for players physically. That's the challenge.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess in that situation, the first thing I'd be thinking about was being really explicit before the training session and framing some shared vocabulary, which is if I don't want to stop to teach and explain things to players or reinforce things during, I would explain to them before, this is what we're going to be working on. We're going to be pressing. These are the most important things for pressing. And then I think it's key therefore I'm likely to be talking to them while they're playing. I think it's hard to communicate a lot while players are playing. And so we have to make sure that we understand the same vocabulary beforehand. And not just vocabulary to describe the game, but the cues that we're going to use. So I might, if I see you doing X, I'll tell you, if you hear stretch, it means make sure you, do the following things. If you hear width, it means do the following things. If you hear compress, I think I'd want to review with players beforehand, not only what we're trying to accomplish, but the cues they might hear that would tell them that they're doing it well or struggling with it, so that I get more. Shared vocabulary allows me to teach more efficiently in any situation, so I'd want them to understand exactly what I was going to say to them. I don't think I can teach very well during live play, but I can remind players of things during live play. The other thing I'd probably be thinking about is assuming that I may have to stop a few times to teach a concept. I'd also be thinking about how can I, there are constant breakages for non-valuable reasons. So I'd also be thinking about how can I engineer my session so that if we do stop, it's high value as opposed to we've stopped because the ball is out of play or players are confused about what to do and I have to break in to just explain the activity to them. And so, John Wooden is sort of famous for this placement of the balls on the basketball court so that there was never a second of downtime and no one ever had to run more than 5 feet for a ball. So, I just think that the mundane details of making sure I and my assistants are always ready with the equipment and a ball goes back into play immediately. So I don't lose my training load for mundane reasons. And then if we do break the physical intensity of training, it's for a high value learning reason.
I had a conversation with a coach last week with a good debate about pre-practice meetings, something that I really value. And then he questioned it. And then once he started putting his point across, I thought, yeah, you got me thinking about that there. I believe that it basically gave the players the session plan, the times of the exercises. It mapped out exactly what we would be doing and why. So it helped operationally. But he felt that then presented, this is exactly what we're going to do. And the game presents different types of challenges. What's your thoughts on this and the best way to approach it?
I'm not sure that there is a right answer, or certainly that I know it. I think I'm inclined to be more transparent with players. Tell them what we're trying to accomplish, or what decisions I want them to make, or what cues I want them to be looking at. It sounds like what your colleague was saying is I want players to be able to react to the game and make decisions for themselves, and not have someone tell me beforehand the decisions I want them to make. But I think you could still prepare them for the types of situations, the principles of play that we're using. I think I'd still want to ensure their attentiveness to most important things, because I think I would honestly do the same thing during the game. I think you'd be unlikely to go into a game not giving players any guidance about what you're trying to do tactically. So, I don't know that there's one right answer. I think, cultures are different, and if there is a right answer, I'm sure I'm not the guy who knows it, but my gut is I tend to think that players learn better when we're transparent with them about what we're trying to accomplish for the most part. So I like the idea of a pre-practice meeting.
Brings us on nicely. You said learning there, the difference between teaching and learning. Can you explain this and then how it applies to training?
Yeah, I think it's for both parts of the cycle. Teaching happens, let's say you break your practice briefly and you explain to players tactically something that you want to do. That's teaching. But the learning really happens afterwards in the application, which is you want one of your players to press higher and get into a passing lane, right? You explain that to him. That's teaching, but he hasn't learned it yet until there are 4 or 5 situations in which he successfully does it and understands whether he's done it or not. And so I think coaches need to be really attentive to what happens after they teach something, because that's when the learning happens. So one of the things that I notice most about training sessions is a coach will make a point during a stoppage. Live play will continue, and he'll be sort of calling comments out to players in real time, and they won't be aligned to the topic that he addressed in the stoppage, right? So the stoppage was, we've got to create more width. We've got to create more width in this situation. We need to be all the way out of the touchline. Play begins. Great ball, David. Super hustle. Yeah, great vision there. Like, none of those comments are related to whether we are successfully getting wide or not. And so aligning live feedback might sound focusing more on really, first of all, looking for in every situation, are we wide? And then saying, yes, that's wide. That's the width we want. Or still wider, so that players know how they're doing in trying to operationalize the teaching that we did. And also know that the teaching is important, and the expectation is that when I stop training to talk to you about something for a minute, that's a big deal. And so I expect you for the next 10 minutes to really focus on using it and applying it, because the 10 minutes after the teaching point is when the learning will really happen.
Great test of focus as well for a coach, isn't it?
Yeah, it's true. Well, I think that's one of the challenges of coaching, which is you are overwhelmed by the complexity. There's so much going on at once. It's so easy to be distracted. And to try and, as a colleague of mine in New Zealand Rugby said, try and chase 5 rabbits, right? You're trying to reinforce 5 things at once, and it ends up being scattered. And it's often faster to really focus on one thing intently for 5 or 10 minutes and make sure that players have got it before you go on to the next thing. And ultimately you make more progress by doing one thing at a time. So I think, you make a stoppage. The first thing you should be thinking about is I have to self-discipline myself to provide consistent reinforcement on how we're doing it. The thing I just told them was important enough to stop training to do. And even then, stop them again if they're still not doing it, or to tell them that they've done it well, or to tell them live, but not to go on to be distracted by all the other things that are in my mind that I want to talk about. I think one of the best tools you can have is, it's hard for me to imagine coaching in a situation as complex as a soccer training session without writing some things down. So you notice a player doing something that's important to talk about, but it's nothing that you just made a stoppage to teach them. So I want to write it down so I remember to come back to it later. But if I come back to it right then, in some ways I'm distracting them from the teaching point, from the linkage that you pointed out between teaching and learning, which is I really want you to focus on doing this one thing that we just talked about.
This is the $1 million question. How should a coach best judge the success of a training session?
I think there are two ways to think about this. One is I want to go back to this idea of exemplar planning, of being really clear about what excellence looks like to me beforehand. So we're not just doing the training activity, but we're doing it with a standard of excellence so that I can look for it and see it and really gather data while we're playing and whether we're doing it. But I think then the second challenge is that most of what we've learned in our lives, we've forgotten. And our players are the same. And if you want any further proof of this, have kids wait 15 years and try and help them with their homework. The problem with learning is that just because players get it right at the end of the session and seem to understand it does not mean they'll understand it in 3 days, in 5 days, in 7 days, in a month. That as soon as we learn something, the battle against forgetting begins. And so I think when I think about the effectiveness about my training sessions, I want to think about whether I got execution to a really high standard of mastery in that session, but then I need to make sure that I come back to it and engage in what I would call a retrieval practice, which is doing the repeating the session, coming back to that set of skills several times over the course of days or weeks or months to make sure that players don't just know how to do it, but it's embedded in long-term memory. Because I think if you want to use it in the game, it has to be in your long-term memory. As soon as we learn something, the battle against forgetting begins. And I just think the coaches overlook that so often. They see players doing it well at the end of one session. They think, right, great, we've got it. We've got pressing. We're pressing really well. As soon as you leave that session, knowledge of pressing starts to decay.
Yeah, so true, so true. From a personal standpoint and my own journey, I really want to move sessions from intensity of players working hard
physically
towards players working hard mentally. What are the best ways for me to do this?
I think it's a great question, and I think about working hard mentally in a couple different ways. I think one, I want to socialize players. I want to build a culture of attentiveness so that players are always at a high level of alertness and awareness on the field. It could mean that I challenge them with, really challenging constraints when we're playing. It doesn't involve my asking them any questions, but it's just, I give them constant challenges that force them to be alert and aware by changing things. The field is narrower this time. The field is wider this time. The field is shorter. But I also think that, most coaches that I know use questioning as a way to engage players mentally. And they think a lot about their questions, but I think oftentimes those questions are undone by the quality of the questions are undone by the environment in which they're asked. In other words, I stop and ask questions and it's the same 3 players answering the questions with the first thing that comes to the top of their heads over and over again. And so even the very best question in the world is not going to build a strong mental environment for players that causes them to constantly be engaged unless I build a situation where every player feels like they have to answer every question, feels like they have to answer every question, are accountable for every question. So, and I think the reason why you get this situation, coach asks a question, saying 2 or 3 players call answers out of the top of their heads, is because coaches aren't clear on how they want players to answer. So for example, as soon as I set the expectation that it's fine to call out an answer to my question, then I can't insert any wait time, which causes players to think more deeply, right? They're going to say the first thing off the top of their heads. And as soon as I build a culture where 2 or 3 players are answering, then the other 8 or 9 players who are less verbal come to think, I'm not going to have to answer anyway because these 3 guys are going to answer it, so I'm checked out. So I can check out. I don't have to really be accountable. So a couple of tools that I think are important are, I think cold calling is really powerful, which is I set the expectation with my players that I'm going to ask by name specific players whether or not they've volunteered to answer a question when I pause. Pause, where should the number 6 be? Maybe, so this is a question that either ideally I want my number 6 to answer, so I say, Carlos, where should you be? Or maybe I need my number 8 to understand where my number 6 is. So great. Jose, where should Carlos be? Where should the number 6 be? Great. And what does that mean? How does that mean you react? Great. And Trevor, what does that mean you need to do? So the idea that anyone can be asked to answer a question at any time, gives me a different relationship to questions on my team. It means I have to be ready, I have to be thinking every time the coach answers a question. So everyone is answering in their heads. Similarly, sometimes when I ask a question and I don't get any answers, I get blank stares, the coach will then jump in by answering the question himself. And I think a great move there is to say, right, turn and talk to the person next to you, 20 seconds, where should the number 6 be and why? Go. 20 seconds to talk. Great. Pause. What did you talk about? What did you decide? Where should the number 6 be? Carlos, David, James. So I think that building that culture of mental accountability is really critical if I'm going to try and use questions. The best question in the world is only so good if only 1 or 2 people answer it.
Yeah, I love that. That building a culture of attentiveness and mental accountability. I'll let you answer it. I think I know what you're going to say. Is it healthy then for every single training session to be mentally challenging, or do I as a coach ever need to worry about mental fatigue?
I think that's a really good question, an important question to ask. And I would say you're probably right that the optimal, well, first of all, I think there are different types of mental challenge. I think I always want my players to be attentive when they're on the field. So I want to focus them, I want them to be alert and aware of perceptive cues. That's different from conscious thinking and being prepared to answer questions. I think there are times when I want my players just to play with, first of all, I want them to play with sheer joy and just and love competition. And I think that's a really important part of building a culture on a team. So there are some times when I just want them to compete and I don't necessarily want them to think deeply. I think when I need them to learn something and change the way that they play the game or develop the way that they play the game, then I really want to stress, I want to build a culture that is as much about mental hustle and engagement as it is about physical engagement. But there are also times when we're not actively trying to install something new or learn something new. We're trying to learn to be competitive. We're learning to play for joy. We're learning to we're learning to play as we will in a game where we're not actively thinking about problem solving and we're engaged in a different way mentally. So I think it's probably a balance. The earlier that players are in learning something, the more complex what they're learning, the more it's absolutely critical that there's a culture of mental engagement and that's actively built. And I think that probably feeds into a culture that socializes players to be attentive when they're playing in a less conscious way. But players are not particularly conscious about what they're doing when they're in the midst of a game. They're making decisions that are so fast they don't really have time to make active decisions about it. It's really a matter of habit. So there are times when I just want to let them build their habits.
In your book, Teach Like a Champion, you talk about avoiding the pitfall of yes and no questions when talking to players. And
Yeah.
so I read it and I'm like, oh, I'm so guilty of that there. Can you give coaches advice on just how to ask better questions and then how to improve engagement?
Yeah, well, I think one of the first things to watch out for is to listen to yourself. And if you say things like, is everybody clear on that? Everybody get it? We clear? I think that's a classic case of asking a rhetorical question. If you say everyone clear on that, everyone's always going to nod and say yes, and I guarantee you that some players are not clear. And so planning in advance, after you've discussed something, a few quick questions that you can ask pepper them around to players to make sure they have understanding. Great. So before we start up, let's make sure we understand when we're pressing high, what's the most important thing for the number 9 to do, the number 11 to do. Ask those questions really quickly of players. 15 seconds, 3 questions to players. Then at least I'm getting a statistical sample of like, do they seem to understand, as opposed to just relying on their self-report. Self-report is almost always unreliable. So I think that's a simple case of where we fall back on yes and no questions. We're basically telling ourselves this would be a great time to check for understanding, but I don't really have time to do it, so I'll just ask guys whether they understand, and they'll nod at me and they'll say they do. And oftentimes that's, that becomes a dead end. But then I think a key thing is we often try to think of our questions on the spur of the moment, and a really healthy habit is to plan in advance 3 or 4 questions that I think will become critical. Even if I don't use them, it helps the quality of my questions become higher. And then building that in a fabric of I socialize my players to understand that when I'm asking a question, anyone could be called on to answer it. And so they have to be ready, and they have to be attentive, and they have to be locked in and really listening carefully.
You've written about correcting instead of critiquing.
Yeah.
Can you explain the difference and why coaches should be aware of it?
Yeah, I think it goes back to your question about the difference between teaching and learning. So players do something incorrectly. I stop them and I explain what they did incorrectly. I've taught them, but they haven't learned it. If I want them to learn it, I have to do it over again and do it better. And so rather than just saying, stop, pause, we played back into pressure there. Right? We have to play wide there. We have to play around pressure. The learning happens when I say, great, let's take the ball back to where David had the ball. Let's play from this situation. Show me how you play out of the pressure. Great, yes, that's better, right? So then when I give players the chance to fix their previous behavior, to do it correctly, that's correction, and that's building their learning. Critiquing them, telling what they did wrong without giving them the opportunity to do it over again and do it better. I guess you could say it's teaching without learning. I think that's just a pitfall that I think a lot of coaches fall into. If you're going to stop to tell them what they did wrong, give them the chance to learn to do it right.
Another quote from your book: when all students engage in thoughtful writing for a sustained period of time, your levels of rigor and participation are both high. Should coaches be implementing support structures that challenge or encourage players to reflect on every session, or is that not a realistic goal in sport?
It's funny. It's a great question. I've almost never been asked it. Writing is so important in the classroom, and there just aren't many opportunities for players to do it on the field. But I do think that, there's powerful potential for players to write afterwards, to reflect. I know programs that have done this, I know there's some clubs in England that have players keep reflective journals, I recall one coach saying, you ask guys after the game how they did and everyone played great. But giving them specific questions to write about, or, I think that writing would be a great tool to use with film review, right? I don't just want you to watch the film. I want you to reflect on how you did and describe your positioning in 3 different cases. It forces players to engage at the highest and most challenging level of cognition. Writing it is harder than saying it. It forces a higher level of intentionality, and you have to put it carefully into words. So I think there's some real potential to do that. And I think there are a lot of great players out there who've kept journals throughout their careers and attribute that level of reflection to their ability to get to the elite level. I think Yaya Toure is a great example of that. I think there's a guy who sustained his level of play at an excellent level and probably outperformed what people thought he would be capable of. He, as I understand it, he, relentlessly kept a journal on his performances to reflect in writing. So maybe there's some potential there.
How should coaches reflect? What's the best way for us to evaluate a session? Is it by videoing ourselves? Is it by reflecting on notes, or is it the game on Saturday, or what's the best ways?
I think video is a fantastic tool for studying your own teaching. The bad news is it's incredibly unforgiving, and the session that you thought was great when you watched it on video, look, you'll see 100 little things that you want to improve on, but that's the path forward. So I think it's really tremendous. You can also audio tape yourself. You'd be surprised how much you can hear just, hearing the language used to players to describe things. How precise is my vocabulary? How negative how negative did I sound when telling my players I want to do something different? So I think that the most objective form to study your own work is in recording it, either on video or on audio. And I think there are other tools that you can use, but to me, that's the most powerful thing. I think one other thing that you can think about is most feedback comes after sessions. Maybe you invite someone to come watch your session and give you feedback on it. Even watching your own videos, post-session feedback. Feedback that comes before a session that I can use to improve my session is actually more valuable. And so if I got together with a couple of colleagues or even with my assistant coaches or with one colleague and shared my session plan and had them give me suggestions and critique or ask me hard questions about my session plan and what I wanted to accomplish, and I got useful feedback before the session plan, then I can implement it in the session plan and see whether it works, see if I'm happy with it, see the difference. And I think that's also a great way to improve. I think generally speaking, the planning process is undervalued as a driver of training success.
And then last one for you, what are the 2 or 3 biggest areas that coaches to improve their sessions this week? Give us something to look at a little bit differently or to think of and maybe create a little bit of awareness right away.
Maybe I'll try and throw out 3 quick ideas. I think the first one is, thinking about the idea of checking for understanding, which is John Wooden framed it as the difference between I taught it and they learned it. It's very, very easy as a coach to explain something to players, have them execute poorly and not realize it. So the first thing I would think about doing is what I call in Teach Like a Champion, tracking, not watching, which is not just observing passively, but having a data tracking tool, a piece of paper on a clipboard, a note card in your pocket where you, as your players play, observe and take notes on whether they're doing the things that you ask them to do successfully. I think what you notice is that it disciplines you to watch for specific things, and that they often are. It's less successful than you think. But whatever happens, rather than being overwhelmed by the data of watching 20 guys do 8 different things at a time, you start to notice whether they're accomplishing the goals. So using an observation tracker to gather data while you're observing your own sessions is a game changer. Number 2, I would say, I just want to go back to an idea that came up briefly during our conversation, which is aligning your live feedback to your stoppage feedback. When you stop a training session, to say this is important to talk about. Not everything you say afterwards should be about it, but 6 out of 8 live comments, 5 out of 8 live comments should say, I'm watching to see whether you did what we talked about. I'm giving you feedback to help you achieve it successfully. And when we talk about something, expectation is that you follow through on it. I just think that very rarely happens. And it has the long-term effect of showing that if the things that I say in a stoppage aren't important enough to me for me to remember them 2 minutes later, why would they be important players? And the last thing I think is just on coaching decision-making. I think perception is hugely underestimated. That many of the times when a player makes a suboptimal decision, it's not because they saw all the options and chose the wrong one. It's because they didn't see all the options, and that in many cases, seeing and deciding are the same thing. So when I make a stoppage, I could ask players, what should you do? But just as good a question is, what should you look at? What should you be noticing here? Where should your eyes go? What are the cues that tell you what you should do? Because in many cases, I think the perception is the decision for players, especially when they're asked to make decisions quickly. And so I just think that's something that we can stress more with players if we want to develop them on the thinking side.
Brilliant. Doug, thank you so much. Fantastic.
Gary, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks so much to Doug for his time and his insight there. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Yeah, from a selfish point of view, I really benefited from that and really enjoyed that conversation. What I got out of it basically was, the 3 different times of it before the session and improving the planning and the preparation stage, and not just exercises and looking at sessions, but also then planning the roles and responsibilities of staff. And I don't think coaches have a problem in preparing for training sessions for the most part. We all get there early enough and we all set the balls out, we all get the cones out. But yeah, maybe what everyone is doing and being a bit more intentional with those roles and responsibilities could lead to better practices. Then improving the execution during the session and a bit more intentional about the problems that we're going to face and maybe forecast those. How are we going to deal with them? The questions which we want to uncover a different level of engagement, a better level of engagement from our players. And then afterwards, improving the review process. Yeah, getting players to reflect, getting coaches to reflect how we interpret success during the training session, how we interpret success with our staff. Are we sharing those with the players as well? And just generally making those consistent and effective and improving them every week. I think in soccer we measure so much data and analytics, but I don't think we're being specific enough in what we want and what we need from every training session. And as I shared there, that's the areas that I'm looking to improve. And definitely as I get more experience as a coach, it's not just getting out there and driving intensity and driving energy and driving focus. It's how to teach or facilitate that in the players and having them taking more ownership of the process as well, which invariably involves the coach giving up a certain amount of control, a large amount of control in some cases. And that's something that we talked with Tony Annan a few weeks ago about how he became a better coach as he left more variables up to the players, which is more risky and probably makes us very, very uncomfortable, but it's definitely the way to go. So love that conversation. Big thanks to Doug, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on it. At Gary Curneen on Twitter, at Gary Curneen on Instagram. Love talking about training, love talking about the coaching during the training session, the session design, all that good stuff. So yeah, we'd love to know what you think. As always, appreciate you listening. Check out Total Football Analysis magazine. I will be getting my copy tomorrow, so get on that there. Get the code Modern Soccer Coach during checkout. Have a great week. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to the Modern Soccer Coach podcast. For more coaching topics, sessions, and resources, head on over to Coach Curneen on Facebook or visit the website at www.modernsoccercoach.com.